The wind in Wyoming held no secrets. It scoured the high plains and canyons with a voice raw from scraping across 1,000 miles of rock and ice. In the spring of 1875, it carried the memory of winter, a chill that clung to the meltwater and settled deep in a man's bones. The thaw had come violently, turning the creeks to brown torrents and the earth to a sucking mud. For Eli Walker, the season was just another turn of a wheel he no longer felt a part of. His cabin sat tucked into a fold of the mountains overlooking the Wind River Valley, a sentinel of weathered pine that had silvered to the color of old ghosts. Here, silence was his crop, his currency, his only companion. 10 years had passed since the war. 10 years of building this quiet fortress against the world. He had 2 horses, a mare named Patience and her gelding, Ghost, whose temper was as steady as a stone. He had a small plot of land where he coaxed potatoes, beans, and hardy greens from the stubborn soil. His days were measured by the sun's arc and the simple, repetitive labor of survival. He chopped wood, mended fences, and hunted just enough to see him through. It was a life whittled down to its most essential parts. Every few months, when the salt ran low or the coffee was gone, he would load a mule and make the long ride down to the small settlement huddled by the river. The place had a name, but he never used it. To him, it was just down below. He would trade a few cured pelts at the general store, his words as spare as his purchases. He would then go to the saloon, not for the company, but for the whiskey. He would take a single glass, drink it standing at the far end of the bar, and place his coins down without a sound. He would nod at the bartender, a man named Silas, and leave. The entire transaction might involve 5 or 6 words. He had learned that words were like currency. The more you spent, the poorer you became. The men in the saloon had long stopped trying to draw him out. They saw the stillness in his eyes, a look they recognized from other men who had seen the elephant at Shiloh or Gettysburg. It was a hollowness that no amount of whiskey or talk could fill. They called him the mountain man, the hermit. They spun stories about him, guessing at the shadows that trailed him. None of them knew his last name, and none of them dared to ask. Eli welcomed their distance. He had come to these mountains to forget the sound of human voices raised in anything but a whisper. He had fled the memory of his brothers, John and Samuel, who lay in the red soil of Virginia, their faces frozen in his mind's eye. He had run from the ghost of the woman he was to marry, Sarah, whose letter had found him in a field hospital. Her words were gentle, full of pity, explaining that life had to go on and she had found a good man, a whole man, to build it with. He did not blame her. What good was half a man to a woman who deserved the world? He had folded the letter and used it to light his pipe, watching her name turn to black ash before it scattered on the wind. He had thought the solitude would be a balm, a quiet poultice for a soul riddled with shrapnel, but the silence of the mountains had a peculiar quality. It amplified the noise inside him. In the dead of night, the quiet of his cabin would be shattered by the phantom roar of cannon fire. The gentle sigh of the wind through the pines would twist into the screams of men. He would wake with his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nostrils, the faces of the dead swimming in the darkness before his eyes. He would rise, stoke the fire, and sit staring into the flames until dawn. The ghosts, his only companions. He had chosen this life to escape the world of men. Yet he could not escape the man he had been. He was haunted by the things he had done to survive and, worse, by the men he had not been able to save. The guilt was a constant, low-grade fever, a sickness for which there was no cure. The mountains were not a sanctuary. They were a prison of his own making, and he was both the inmate and the warden. On a late afternoon in April, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. A storm that should have been rain fell as a wet, heavy sleet, clinging to the new buds on the aspens and turning the ground to a treacherous slurry. Eli was in his small barn, brushing down Patience after a ride to check his snares. The wind howled, rattling the poorly fitted door and driving icy needles through the cracks in the walls. He worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, his thoughts quiet for once, lost in the simple, honest work of caring for an animal. That is when he heard it. At first, it was a thin thread of sound, nearly indistinguishable from the cry of a hawk or the shriek of the wind around the eaves. He paused, his hand still on the mare's flank, his head cocked. He listened, holding his breath. There was only the storm. He dismissed it, turning back to his work. Perhaps the loneliness was finally making him imagine things. Then it came again, louder this time, sharper. It was a sound that cut through the gale's fury, a sound of pure terror. It was unmistakably human. A scream, a woman's scream. It came from the direction of the river, a raw, desperate cry that was swallowed almost immediately by the storm. Something in Eli, a part of him he thought had died in the war, broke through the ice of his isolation. It was an instinct older and more powerful than his desire for solitude. It was the instinct to answer a cry for help, to run toward the sound of another's pain. He dropped the brush and strode out of the barn, pulling his coat tighter against the biting sleet. He did not bother with his rifle. There was no time. He moved quickly through the trees, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The roar of the river grew louder as he descended the steep slope. A thunderous, angry sound. The Wind River was in a rage, swollen with melted snow from the high country. It was a churning maelstrom of brown water, carrying with it whole trees, their branches clawing at the air like the arms of drowning giants. He reached the bank, his eyes scanning the torrent. The sleet stung his face, half blinding him. For a moment, he saw nothing but the wild, chaotic water. He thought perhaps he had been wrong, that the wind had played a trick on him. He was about to turn back when he saw a flash of color, a patch of blue fabric snagged on a submerged log far out in the current. And then he saw an arm, a hand, reaching, grasping at nothing. Another scream was ripped from a throat, weaker this time, a sound of utter exhaustion and despair. Without a second thought, without weighing the cost, Eli Walker plunged into the freezing, violent water. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving 1,000 icy knives into his skin. The current seized him immediately, a force of nature that cared nothing for his strength or his will. It dragged him under, tumbling him over and over in the gritty darkness. He fought his way to the surface, gasping, his lungs burning. He saw the woman again, closer now. He could make out her face, pale and terrified, her long dark hair plastered across her cheeks. He was a strong swimmer, but this was not swimming. This was a battle against a liquid beast. He aimed himself downstream, using the current's own power to propel him toward her. Debris slammed into him, a heavy branch striking his shoulder with bruising force. He ignored the pain. His focus narrowed to that one point in the chaos, the small island of another's life in the middle of all that death. He reached her just as the log she was clinging to began to roll, threatening to pull her under for good. He grabbed her arm, his fingers locking around her wrist with a strength born of desperation. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, met his. She tried to say something, but her throat only produced a choked, gurgling sound.
"Hold on to me!"
he yelled over the river's roar. Getting her back to shore was a nightmare. She was a dead weight, her strength gone. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her head above the water while he fought the current with his other arm and his legs. The river did not want to let them go. It pulled at them, trying to drag them down into its cold, dark heart. Eli's muscles screamed in protest. His lungs felt as if they were filled with fire and ice, but he did not let go. He kicked and pulled, inch by agonizing inch, fighting for every foot. He saw a small inlet where a creek fed into the main river, the water slightly less violent. He aimed for it, pouring the last of his strength into one final, desperate push. His feet touched the bottom, sinking into the soft mud. He stumbled, half falling, and dragged the woman with him out of the main current and into the relative calm of the shallower water. He hauled her the last few feet onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside her, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. For a long time, he could do nothing but lie there, gasping for air, the sleet beating down on his back. The woman lay beside him, a still, silent bundle of wet clothes and colder skin. He feared he was too late. He rolled over, his movements stiff and painful, and put his ear to her chest. He heard it, faint, shallow, but there, a heartbeat, a flicker of life in the midst of the storm. Finding a new reserve of strength, he managed to get to his feet. He scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail. He started the long, arduous climb back up the slope to his cabin, his legs protesting with every step. The wind tore at them, trying to push them back down the hill, but Eli leaned into it, his jaw set, his focus on the small sanctuary of his home. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man with a purpose that lay unconscious and freezing in his arms. He had gone down to the river to answer a scream, and in doing so, had found something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to fight. The ghosts in his head were silent for once, drowned out by the roar of the river and the hammering of his own heart. He had stepped back into the world of the living. The journey to the cabin was a fight for every step. The ground, slick with mud and melting sleet, tried to pull him back down toward the raging river. The woman in his arms felt impossibly fragile, a bird with a broken wing, yet her weight seemed to increase with each upward heave of his legs. His own clothes, soaked through and were a second skin of ice, and the muscles in his back and shoulders burned with a fire that gave no warmth. The wind was a malevolent presence, shrieking in his ears, clawing at his burden, trying to rip her away from him. He bowed his head against it, his world reduced to the next foothold, the next labored breath. He did not know how long it took. Time had dissolved into a brutal rhythm of effort and endurance. But at last, the dark, solid shape of his cabin emerged from the swirling gray of the storm. He had never seen it as a sanctuary before. It had always been a place of exile. Now, it was a beacon. He stumbled the last few yards, his boots heavy as lead, and kicked the door open with his foot. The single room was dark and cold, but it was still. The roar of the storm was instantly muted to a low moan. He crossed the rough-hewn floorboards in 3 strides and gently laid the woman down on his cot, the only piece of furniture in the room besides a small table and a single chair. She did not stir. Her skin had a bluish tinge, and her lips were the color of ash. There was no time for deliberation. He knew what had to be done. He turned and threw logs into the stone fireplace, his movements clumsy with cold. He used the last of his kindling, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 attempts to strike a match. The flame caught, small and tentative at first, then growing, casting flickering orange light across the small room. He turned back to the woman. Her wet clothes were a death shroud, leaching the last of her warmth. There was no modesty in survival. He had learned that in the war, tending to the torn bodies of men who had been his friends. He worked with a grim, impersonal efficiency. He found his sharpest knife and carefully cut away the sodden dress, the fabric stiff with cold and mud. He peeled away the layers of her undergarments, his touch as gentle as he could make it. Her skin was like ice. He saw dark bruises on her arms and a faded, ugly mark on her shoulder that the river had not put there. He filed the observation away, his mind focused only on the immediate task. He stripped off his own wet things, standing for a moment in the biting cold of the cabin before pulling on a dry pair of wool trousers and a shirt. He took the 2 thick wool blankets he owned, the ones meant to see him through the harshest nights of winter, and wrapped her tightly, cocooning her from head to toe. He lifted her again, her head lolling against his shoulder, and placed her on the floor in front of the now roaring fire, propping her head up with a rolled-up burlap sack. Then began the vigil. He sat in his lone chair, feeding the fire, watching for any sign of life. The hours bled into one another. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way inside. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the logs and the woman's shallow, ragged breathing. He made coffee, strong and black, and drank it scalding from a tin cup. The heat did little to touch the cold that had settled deep in his marrow. He watched her, this piece of driftwood the world had thrown at his door. He had spent a decade building walls to keep humanity out, and in a single moment of instinct, he had carried it across his own threshold. He felt a strange and unwelcome stirring inside him, a sense of responsibility he had not known since he was a corporal trying to keep his young charges alive. It was a heavy, uncomfortable weight. He did not want it. He wanted only his silence, his ghosts, the predictable emptiness of his days. But the woman on his floor was not a ghost. She was flesh and blood, and her life was now tangled up with his. The river had taken her, and then it had given her back, not to the world she had come from, but to him. Sometime near dawn, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh. It was in that quiet space between the storm and the morning that her eyes opened. They were not the slow, drowsy eyes of someone waking from a peaceful sleep. They flew open, wide and filled with a stark, animal terror. They were the eyes of a deer caught in a hunter's snare. She took a sharp, gasping breath and tried to scramble backward, tangling herself in the blankets. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, from the rough log walls to the fire, and finally, to him. A low sound of fear escaped her throat. Eli remained perfectly still in his chair. He made no move to stand, no gesture that could be seen as a threat. He kept his hands in his lap, open and visible. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry, broken whisper. "My cabin," he said. His own voice sounded rusty from disuse. "You were in the river. I pulled you out." The information did not seem to calm her. The terror in her eyes sharpened into a desperate, pleading panic. She pushed herself up on one elbow, the blanket falling away to reveal her bare shoulder. "The town?" she rasped. "You cannot take me back to the town." Eli just looked at her. He saw the way she trembled, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He saw the frantic look in her eyes as she searched his face, looking for something, some sign of what he intended to do. "Please," she whispered, and the word was a prayer. "I cannot go back there. Please, sir, I am begging you." He thought of the settlement down below, the saloon, the general store, the small, tight world he avoided. He thought of the questions that would be asked, the stares, the complications. He looked at the bruises on her arms and the terror that seemed etched into her very soul. The river had been a simple, honest enemy. He suspected the one she was running from was not. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The storm is not done yet," he said, his voice low and even. "No one is going anywhere." It was not a promise of permanence, but it was enough. The tension in her shoulders seemed to lessen by a fraction. She sank back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her wide, fearful eyes never leaving his face. Eli stood up slowly and went to the fire. He ladled some broth he had made from dried meat into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the floor, a safe distance from her, along with a cup of water. "You need to eat," he said, and then he retreated to his chair. He had made a choice. He had allowed this complication, this stray piece of humanity, to remain within his walls. He did not know her name. He did not know what she had done, or what had been done to her. He only knew that for now. The fortress he had built for one would have to shelter two. The river, in its fury, had washed away the quiet order of his life. He did not know if it was a baptism or a drowning. He only knew that nothing would be the same. The day passed in a silence that was heavier than the storm had been. The woman, who had whispered her name, was Amelia, did not speak again after her initial plea. She drank the broth from the wooden bowl. her hands trembling so much she had to hold it with both. She huddled in the blankets by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames as if she could draw some strength from their dance. She was like a wild thing brought to ground, wary of every sound, every movement. Eli went about his chores with a deliberate, quiet purpose. He fed the horses, his movements slow and predictable. He went outside to secure a loose shutter that was banging in the wind's dying gasps. Each time he left the cabin, he left the door slightly ajar, a small, unspoken signal that she was not a prisoner. When he returned, he would find her in the exact same position, a statue carved from fear. He did not try to make conversation. Words were a currency he had long since stopped trading in, and he sensed that for her, they were a field littered with mines. He found one of his old, patched shirts and a spare pair of trousers he used for work and laid them on the small table. He did not look at her as he did it. He simply set them down and then busied himself mending a piece of tack, his back to the fire. He heard a soft rustling behind him and knew she had taken them. A while later, dressed in clothes that hung on her small frame like a scarecrow's. She placed her own ruined dress near the hearth, a silent offering to the flames. Eli took it without a word and fed it to the fire. The wet wool hissed and smoked before catching, the fabric turning to black, curling ash. It was a funeral for a life he knew nothing about. As the afternoon light faded, the shadows in the small cabin grew long and deep. The enclosed space, which had felt like a refuge from the storm, began to feel small, intimate, and charged with an unspoken tension. The world outside disappeared into a black, windy void, leaving only the two of them, two strangers bound by a violent river and a shared silence. The fire was the only light, painting their faces in shifting tones of orange and red. Eli cooked a simple meal of fried salt pork and boiled potatoes. He divided it onto 2 tin plates, placing one on the floor near her and taking his own to his chair. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the steady crackle of the fire. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a physical weight. He did not meet it. He knew that look. It was the look of someone trying to measure a man, to calculate the exact moment the threat would be revealed. He had seen it in the eyes of captured rebels and frightened new recruits. It was a look that made his own ghosts stir restlessly. When the meal was done, he washed the plates in a bucket of water and set them aside. The night had fully settled in. There was nothing left to do but wait for the morning. The cot, his cot, stood against the far wall. It was a narrow bed, barely big enough for one man, and it represented a chasm between them. He took his extra blanket, the thinner, more worn of the two, and spread it on the floorboards, as far from the fire and from her as the small room would allow. He was a big man, and the floor would be hard and cold, but it was a sacrifice he made without a second thought. It was a gesture, a line drawn in the dirt. You are there, I am here. You are safe. He saw her tense as she watched him prepare his makeshift bed. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the wool blanket she still had wrapped around her shoulders. She drew her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller, a target more difficult to hit. The air grew thick with her fear. He finished laying out the blanket and turned to put another log on the fire, his movements slow, telegraphing his intent. He would keep the fire going all night. It was the only comfort he could offer. As he crouched before the hearth, his back to her, he heard her voice, so quiet it was almost lost in the hiss of the flames. Will you stay if I undress? The words hung in the air, fragile and sharp as spun glass. Eli froze, his hand hovering over the log pile. It was not a question of desire. He knew that instantly, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut. The tone was all wrong. It was flat, devoid of emotion. The rote recitation of a line learned through painful repetition. It was not an invitation. It was a bargain, a plea, a desperate attempt to name the terms of her own surrender. It was the question of a woman who had learned that her body was the only thing of value she had to offer in exchange for not being hurt worse. He remained crouched for a long moment, the heat of the fire on his face, a different kind of chill running down his spine. He thought of all the ugliness he had seen, the casual cruelty of men with power over others. He slowly turned, not standing, but swiveling on the balls of his feet to face her. He met her eyes in the flickering light. They were wide and dark, bottomless pools of old pain. He kept his voice low, steady, a rock in the turbulent water of her fear. "No one is going to touch you here," he said. The words were simple, but he filled them with the weight of a solemn oath. He did not say her name. He did not know it well enough. He spoke to the terror he saw looking out from behind her eyes. "You are safe, that is all." For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Her mind seemed to be struggling to understand his words, to fit them into a world that had clearly taught her they could not be true. He saw a flicker of confusion, then disbelief, and then something inside her broke. Her face crumpled. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. She made no sound, no sob, no cry for help. The tears simply fell. A silent, steady rain from a storm that had been brewing inside her for years. She bent her head, hiding her face in her knees, her shoulders shaking with the force of a grief too profound for sound. Eli felt a powerful, primitive urge to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort. But he knew, with that same gut-level certainty, that a single touch from him now would shatter the fragile trust his words had just built. It would prove her fears right. It would make him just another man who took what he wanted. So he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He did nothing. He turned his back on her weeping and placed the log carefully onto the fire. He watched the new flames lick at the seasoned wood, his jaw tight. He was a man who had built a fortress of silence to keep the world out, and now he was using that same silence as a shield to protect someone else. He went to his bed on the floor and lay down, pulling the thin blanket over him. He did not sleep. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark, smoke-stained beams of his ceiling. He listened. He listened to the pop and crackle of the fire. He listened to the wind moaning around the corners of the cabin, and he listened to the quiet, heartbreaking sound of a woman crying for the first time in what he suspected was a very, very long time. He lay there as her weeping slowly subsided, replaced by the soft, even rhythm of exhausted sleep. He remained awake, a sentinel in the darkness. The fire burned between them, a small, steady sun in their shared night. It was not the warmth of passion, but something far more rare and precious. It was the warmth of kindness, a fragile flame lit in the heart of two frozen souls. And in that quiet, watchful darkness, something new and unfamiliar began to take root in the barren ground of Eli Walker's heart. It was not love, not yet. It was the first, tentative shoot of healing. The morning after the storm of tears was born into a profound quiet. When Amelia woke, she was still on the floor, but the fire had been built up to a steady, comforting blaze. Eli was gone. A moment of panic seized her before she saw his heavy coat was missing from its peg and heard the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. He was not gone. He was just living, and for the first time, the thought of another day did not fill her with a soul-crushing dread. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a heartbeat. A silent agreement was forged between them, an understanding that existed in the space between words. Amelia began to move about the cabin, her steps tentative at first, then more sure. She swept the floor with a broom made of bundled twigs. She scrubbed the 2 tin plates until they shone. She found a needle and thread in Eli's small supply box and mended the tear in his shirt with small, neat stitches. They were the actions of a person reclaiming her own hands, her own agency. Eli watched this transformation from the corner of his eye, his solitary world. once as ordered and unchanging as the stars, was being gently rearranged. He found his spare blanket folded neatly on his cot each morning. The cabin, which had always been merely a shelter, began to feel like a home. There was a pot of weak coffee waiting for him when he came in from tending the horses. These small acts of care were an unfamiliar language, but one he slowly began to understand. He started leaving wildflowers he found on the table, small bursts of purple and yellow against the gray wood. He never acknowledged giving them, and she never acknowledged receiving them, but they were a conversation all the same. He learned the cadence of her presence. He learned the soft shuffle of her feet, the way she hummed a tune so low it was barely audible when she kneaded dough for biscuits, the way she would stand at the open door and stare out at the mountains, her expression distant and unreadable. He had forgotten what it was like to share a space with another person, to unconsciously adjust his own movements to accommodate theirs. It was an unsettling and yet strangely comforting dance. His solitude had been a shield, but he was beginning to realize it had also been a cage. One afternoon, while she was outside, he was adding a new shelf to the wall. He moved the small wooden crate where she kept the few things she had salvaged from her ruined dress, the things she must have had in a pocket. A small, tarnished silver locket fell to the floor with a soft clink. He picked it up. It was oval, worn smooth by countless touches, with a delicate engraving of a vine around its edge. His fingers, clumsy and calloused, fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside, protected by a piece of cloudy glass, was a tiny, faded portrait of a baby, a little boy with wide, serious eyes and a fuzz of pale hair, wrapped in a white blanket. Eli stared at the small face, a ghost from a life he could not imagine. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser on sacred ground. He quickly closed the locket and placed it back in the crate just as he heard her footsteps approaching. He turned back to his work, his hammer strokes suddenly loud and clumsy in the quiet cabin. He did not speak of what he had seen, but the knowledge of it settled between them, another unspoken truth. The thaw gave way to a true, vibrant spring. Amelia found Eli's small vegetable patch and began to tend it with a fierce devotion. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, and her hands, once pale and soft, became chapped and stained with dirt. She was coaxing life from the earth, and in doing so, she was coaxing it back into herself. One evening, they sat outside the cabin as twilight bled across the sky, turning the snow-capped peaks to shades of rose and violet. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Eli was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical task a comfort to him. Amelia was staring out at the valley below. "I had 2 brothers," Eli said, his voice quiet, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. "John and Samuel. We all signed up together." He paused, his hands stilling on the rifle stock. "I was the only one who came home." He had never said those words aloud to another living soul. They felt strange in his mouth, like stones he had carried for a decade. He did not know why he said them now. Perhaps it was the peacefulness of the evening, or perhaps it was the quiet, steady presence of the woman beside him. Amelia turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were not filled with pity, but with a deep, knowing sorrow. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed trousers and pulled out the small silver locket. She held it out to him on the palm of her hand. He already knew what was inside, but he took it and opened it anyway. "His name was Daniel," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "He was beautiful. He had his father's eyes." She looked away, back toward the mountains. "There was a fever that winter. It took so many of the little ones. He was gone in 3 days. I held him the whole time." Eli looked from the tiny face in the locket to the woman beside him. He saw the immense, crushing weight of her loss, a burden as heavy as his own. He finally understood the depths of the sorrow she carried. He had been so lost in his own ghosts. He had not recognized that he was living with another haunted soul. "I am sorry," he said. The words felt small, inadequate, but they were all he had. She gave a small, sad smile. He was the only good thing, the only true thing. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. The man I was with, the man Daniel's father, he was not my husband. The confession fell into the quiet air. It was a truth that could get a woman shunned, cast out, branded for life. Eli did not react. He just waited, listening. "My family was poor," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, as if speaking the truth was making her stronger. "He came through our town, handsome and full of promises. He promised marriage, a home, a good life. I believed him. I left with him. But the preacher never came. The papers were never signed. And by the time Daniel was born, I understood. The promises were lies. I was convenient. I was his property, but I was not his wife." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face, bracing for the judgment, the disgust she had been taught to expect. When Daniel died, something inside him broke for good. The kindness he pretended to have, it all vanished. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, no family to go back to. I was a fallen woman, a disgrace. But I could not stay forever. He was a gambler, and his debts were getting bigger, his temper shorter. One night, I knew if I did not leave, I would not see the morning. So I ran. I just ran. I ended up at the river. She finished her story, and a profound silence descended. The last of the light had faded from the sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear. She had laid her entire life bare before him, the grief and the shame, the two heaviest burdens a person could carry. She waited for his verdict. Eli looked at her, at this woman who had survived so much. He thought of the laws of men, the papers and titles and judgments that happened down below. They meant nothing up here. The mountains did not care about a marriage license. The river did not ask for your family name before it tried to swallow you. Up here, a person was measured by their ability to endure. He closed the locket gently and handed it back to her. "Papers do not mean much," he said, his voice rough. "What matters is what you did. You survived." Amelia stared at him, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the water, he saw the fear in her eyes fully recede, replaced by a raw, overwhelming wave of relief. He had not judged her. He had not condemned her. He had seen all of her broken pieces, all of her shame, and he had simply called her a survivor. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but this one was not from sorrow. It was from the startling, painful, beautiful shock of being accepted. He stood up and put his rifle away. "The nights are still cold," he said gruffly. "We should go inside." She nodded, wiping the tear away with the back of her hand. They went back into the small cabin, into the warmth of the firelight. The space between them was no longer filled with the ghosts of their pasts, but with a new, fragile, and powerful understanding. They were two solitary people, two survivors, who had found an unlikely sanctuary in a cabin nestled between the ghosts of a long war and a lost child. And for the first in a very long time, neither of them felt completely alone. The peace they had built was as delicate as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. For weeks, their world had been defined by the cabin, the garden, and the vast, silent mountains. The intrusion, when it came, was an alien sound, a rhythmic beat that did not belong to the natural world. It was the sound of a horse being pushed hard up the trail. Eli heard it first. He was sitting on the small porch, oiling a piece of harness leather, the familiar scent of the wax a small comfort. He went still, his head lifting like a wolf scenting danger on the wind. Amelia was in the garden patch, her back to the cabin, her hands in the soil. She had not heard it yet. He watched her for a moment, this woman who had brought a quiet, fragile life back into his silent world. A fierce, protective instinct, an emotion he had thought long dead, rose in his chest. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. and moved to the edge of the porch. A minute later, a rider broke through the tree line. He was young, barely a man, with a brash confidence in the way he sat his saddle. He rode a fine-looking bay horse, lathered with sweat from the climb. The young man reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his eyes taking in the scene with a sweep of casual ownership. He looked at Eli. Then his gaze slid past him to where Amelia was now standing, alerted by the horse's arrival. Eli saw the color drain from her face. She froze, her hand still holding a small trowel, a figure of dirt-stained terror. The past had a horse, and it had just ridden into their sanctuary. "Afternoon," the young man said. His voice was loud, too loud for the quiet of the mountains. "Quite the climb you got here." Eli did not answer. He simply stood there, his presence a silent question. A granite wall. The rider's confident smile faltered for a second under Eli's unblinking stare. He cleared his throat. "I am looking for someone. A woman. Fella down in the town said you were the only soul living up this way?" His eyes fixed on Amelia. "Said I might find a woman here." "You heard wrong," Eli said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he had not used in years, the one that gave no ground. The young man's gaze did not leave Amelia. "That her?" he asked, tipping his head in her direction. She fit the description. Dark hair, name of Amelia Jensen. At the sound of the name, Amelia flinched as if struck. "You have the wrong place," Eli said again, his voice dropping a notch lower. Harder. He took a single step forward, off the porch and onto the hard-packed earth. It was not a threat, but it was a clear signal. "This is my ground." The rider shifted in his saddle, his hand moving to rest on his thigh, near the pistol holstered there. "I do not think I do," he said, his bravado returning. "See, the thing is, Amelia Jensen is wanted. Her man, Jacob Jensen. He turned up dead a few weeks back, and she disappeared, along with a good bit of his money." The young man's eyes narrowed, a smug, accusatory look on his face. "Folks are saying she is the one who did for him before she ran." The accusation, ugly and false, hung in the clean mountain air. Eli felt Amelia's terror from across the yard. It was a tangible thing, a cold wave of despair. He knew that in this moment, his 10 years of carefully guarded solitude were over. He could retreat back into his silence, turn his back, and let the world of men have her. Or he could stand his ground. It was not a choice. "The woman here is under my protection," Eli stated. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The words were heavy, each one a stone laid in a wall between the rider and Amelia. "She has done nothing wrong. You will turn your horse around and ride back down the way you came." The young man laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "Under your protection, and who are you to be protecting anyone? You are just some hermit hiding from the world." He leaned forward, his voice turning mean. "Amos Jensen, Jacob's brother. He is the one who sent me. He wants his brother's money back, and he wants the woman who took it. He has got the law on his side." "The law does not live up here," Eli said softly. "Now, I will not tell you again." Something in Eli's stillness, in the dead certainty in his eyes, finally seemed to penetrate the young man's arrogance. He was looking at a man who was not afraid of him, a man who was not afraid of anything he could bring. This was not some scared old prospector. The rider looked from Eli's hard face to Amelia's terrified one, and then back again. He gathered his reins. "This is not over," he spat. "Amos will hear about this. He will come himself." Without another word, he wheeled his horse around, digging his heels into its flanks. The animal leaped forward, and they disappeared back into the trees, leaving behind a trampled silence and the lingering poison of his words. Eli stood for a long time, listening until the sound of the horse's retreat was completely gone. He then turned. Amelia had not moved. She was still standing by the small garden, the trowel fallen from her hand. Her face was a mask of utter desolation. He walked over to her. He did not speak. He simply stood before her, waiting. "It is worse than I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jacob, he was not just unkind. He was a monster when he drank, and he was always drinking." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. He gambled everything away. We had nothing left. He owed money to dangerous men, men who do not forgive debts. She took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out now in a desperate flood. "That night, the night I ran, he came home in a rage. He had lost everything. He told me those men were coming. He said they would take what was owed from him, and then, from me." Her voice broke. "He was not a good man, Eli, but I did not kill him. I swear I did not. I think they did. The men he owed, I think they came for him after I was gone." She was crying now, the silent tears he had seen before. "The money, it was a lie. There was no money. I took $20 from a jar in the kitchen, just enough to get away. It was all that was left in the world. Amos knows that. He just wants someone to blame, someone to punish." She looked so small, so utterly broken, standing there in the middle of the life she had tried to build from ashes. He had pulled her from the river, but he now saw that the real flood was the one that had just followed her up the mountain. Eli reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched her arm. It was the first time he had touched her since that first night. His touch was not one of passion, but of steadfast solidarity. "I believe you," he said. The simple words seemed to hold her up, to give her a piece of solid ground in her swirling world of fear. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. "But what are we going to do?" she whispered. "He said Amos would come. He will bring men. He will bring the law." Eli looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the familiar lines of the mountains that had been his refuge. They no longer looked like a sanctuary. They looked like a fortress that was about to be besieged. He had spent 10 years trying to escape the world of men and their petty cruelties, their false justice, and now it had found him. It had found him because he had chosen to help one of its victims. His past and present were colliding. The man who had run from a war was now facing a new one, right on his own doorstep. His honor, a concept he thought he had buried with his brothers, was being called to account. He could send her away, send her down the mountain to face whatever fate awaited her. It would be the safe thing to do. It would restore his precious, empty peace. He looked back down at her, at the tear-streaked face of a woman who had been given nothing but pain from the world. He had pulled her from the water. He could not throw her back in now. "Let them come," Eli Walker said, and his voice was the sound of a man who had finally chosen a side. "We will be ready." The waiting began. It was a different kind of silence than the one Eli had cultivated for a decade. His old silence had been a hollow, echoing thing, a space he had carved out to keep the world at bay. This new silence was a taut wire, humming with unspoken tension and the constant, listening presence of an approaching threat. The peace of their sanctuary was gone, replaced by the grim atmosphere of a garrison awaiting a siege. Eli changed. The quiet homesteader receded, and the soldier he had tried to bury for 10 years re-emerged. His movements took on a new, sharper economy. He spent an entire afternoon cleaning his rifle and revolver, the familiar scent of gun oil and oiled leather filling the small cabin. He worked with a focused, methodical calm that Amelia found both terrifying and reassuring. He was not angry or agitated. He was preparing. He walked the perimeter of his small clearing, his eyes not on the wildflowers or the new growth, but on sight lines, on angles of approach, on places that offered cover. He was reading the land not as a home, but as a battlefield. Amelia watched him, and she changed too. The tentative hope that had begun to blossom in her was now tempered with a hard resolve. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it no longer paralyzed her. She had a stake in this fight. She had a life to defend. a life she was only just beginning to believe she deserved. She could not handle a rifle, but she could prepare. She baked biscuits and wrapped them in cloth. She made a fresh pot of coffee and kept it warm by the fire. She ensured there was a clean bucket of water and bandages torn from an old shirt. They were the small, essential tasks of a field hospital, the work of keeping a soldier ready. They worked in tandem, their separate tasks weaving together into a single-purpose survival. They were a garrison of two. The days were long and filled with this tense preparation, but the nights were harder. When darkness fell, it erased the familiar mountains and trees, leaving only the small, defiant bubble of light from the cabin. The world outside became a black, unknown sea from which anything could emerge. The threat felt closer, more intimate, in the dark. They would eat their simple meals in near silence, the firelight casting their shadows long and dancing on the log walls. In the flickering light, they would catch each other's eye, and in that shared glance, the fear, the uncertainty, and the fierce, unspoken bond between them passed back and forth. One night, a few days after the rider had come, the air was particularly still. A full moon had risen, bathing the clearing in a soft, ethereal silver light. It was a beautiful, peaceful night that felt like a cruel joke. They had finished their meal, and Eli was staring into the fire, his face grim, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, back on some other moonlit night that had ended in smoke and screaming. Amelia watched him, her heart aching for the weight he was carrying, a weight he had taken on for her. He had saved her from the river. He had saved her from her own despair. And now, he was prepared to stand between her and the world to save her again. She thought of her past, of a life where her body was a currency, a thing to be bartered or taken. She thought of the shame and the fear that had been her constant companions. But sitting here, in this small cabin, she had found something she never knew existed, a quiet, unconditional respect. Eli had never once made her feel sullied or small. He had looked at her bruises and her shame and had seen only a survivor. He had given her back her own dignity, a piece at a time. She stood up and walked to where he sat in his chair. She knelt on the floor beside him, her presence pulling him from his dark reverie. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of ghosts. "You have saved me more than once, Eli," she said, her voice soft but steady, with no trace of the fear that had defined her for so long. "Let me thank you." He did not understand. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, but he could not grasp her meaning. He thought she meant to offer him a service, to repay a debt. "You do not owe me anything," he said, his voice rough. She gave him a small, sad smile. "I know," she said. "This is not a debt. This is a gift." Slowly, with a grace and deliberation that was almost ceremonial, she reached for the buttons of the patched shirt he had given her. Her fingers were steady. She was not the trembling, terrified woman he had pulled from the river. This was a woman making a conscious choice, one by one. She undid the buttons and shrugged the shirt from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor behind her. She then untied the rope that held up her trousers and let them fall as well. She stood before him in the firelight, clad only in the shifting shadows and the silver moonlight that streamed through the window. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He did not look away. He saw the faint, ugly mark on her shoulder, the faded map of an old pain. He saw the faint lines on her skin that spoke of hardship and hunger. He saw a body that had been a vessel for another's cruelty, and a vessel for a life that had been tragically lost. But what he saw most clearly was not a damaged or sullied woman. He saw a phoenix rising. He saw a soul choosing to be reborn in the heart of a fire, not of destruction, but of quiet sanctuary. This was not an act of surrender. It was an act of profound and defiant courage. It was her way of washing away the past, of declaring that her body was her own, and that she was choosing to share its truth with him. He saw his own reflection in her bravery. He, too, was covered in scars, a long, jagged one on his ribs from a piece of shrapnel. Smaller ones on his arms and legs from the petty violences of war, and the deeper ones, the ones that did not show, the scars on his soul. From the things he had seen and the men he had lost, in her vulnerability, he saw his own. He rose slowly from his chair and stood before her. He did not reach for her. He simply looked at her, his eyes tracing the story of her life written on her skin. And in his gaze, there was no lust, no pity, only a deep and overwhelming reverence. He was seeing her, all of her, for the very first time. He reached up and gently, his calloused thumb traced the line of the old scar on her shoulder. His touch was not a claim, but a question, an acknowledgement. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, a silent answer. In that moment, the fear that had lived between them finally died, consumed by the warmth of the fire. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a quiet, desperate, and beautiful collision of two lonely souls who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with simple kindness. Her lips were soft, and he tasted the salt of a single tear that had escaped and traced a path to her mouth. He lifted her into his arms, as he had done on the bank of the river. But this time, she was not a cold, unconscious burden. She was warm and alive, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was about to be swept away. He carried her the few feet to his cot and laid her down gently on the rough wool blanket. Their coming together was as quiet and as profound as the mountain night outside. It was a slow, gentle exploration, a rediscovery of a language their bodies had forgotten how to speak. It was a communion of scars, seen and unseen. Every touch was a prayer, every caress a form of healing. For her, it was the reclaiming of her own flesh, the discovery that intimacy could be a gift freely given, not a price paid for safety. For him, it was the breaking down of the last wall, the letting in of a warmth that thawed a part of his soul he thought had been frozen forever. In the heart of their small, threatened fortress, in the face of the violence that was coming for them, they chose to create a moment of life, a defiant act of grace. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow cot, the fire burning low, casting a soft, warm glow over the cabin. Amelia lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was the sound of safety, the sound of life. The threat outside had not gone away. The morning would still come. And with it, perhaps, Amos Jensen and his men. But for now, in the quiet dark, they had found a peace that was stronger than any fear. They had faced their own ghosts. And in the night of scars, they had found not love, not yet, but something even more essential. They had found the beginning of a reason to live for it. They woke to a world washed clean. The moonlight had given way to a pale, clear dawn, and the air held the sharp, cold promise of a beautiful day. The night of scars had left behind a quiet intimacy, a fragile sense of peace that felt both profound and terrifyingly precarious. For the first time in a decade, Eli had not been woken by ghosts. He had woken with the warmth of Amelia beside him, her soft breathing a steady rhythm against his chest. It was a beginning, and they both knew it was a beginning that could be ended before the sun was high in the sky. The sound came not as a sudden crash, but as a low, growing vibration felt through the soles of their feet. It was the sound of multiple horses, moving with purpose, not the meandering pace of a lost traveler. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the soldier's instinct overriding the soft-edged man who had woken just moments before. He pulled on his trousers and shirt, his movements swift and silent. "Stay inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason until I tell you." Amelia was already up, her eyes wide with the returning tide of fear, but she nodded, her chin set with a resolve that mirrored his own. She grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door and handed it to him. Their hands brushed, a brief, desperate acknowledgement of everything that was at stake. Eli stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not have to wait long. 5 riders emerged from the trees, fanning out to form a grim semicircle in front of the cabin. 4 of them were hard-faced men with the hired look of casual violence. The 5th man, at their center, was different. He was older than the boy he had sent, dressed in a black coat and a clean hat. He sat tall on a fine black horse, his face a mask of cold, predatory piety. There was a family resemblance to the man Amelia had described, but where Jacob had been ruled by hot rage, this man was clearly forged from ice. It had to be Amos Jensen. Beside him, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was a man with a tarnished star pinned to his vest, the sheriff from down below. He had a fleshy, complacent face and eyes that refused to meet Eli's. "That is far enough." Eli's voice cut through the cold morning air, stopping the riders 20 yards from the porch. Amos Jensen surveyed Eli with a contemptuous gaze. He looked at the weathered cabin, the small garden, and the tall, solitary man standing before it all. "You must be the hermit," Amos said, his voice smooth and laced with disdain. "I am Amos Jensen, and that woman you are hiding is a murderer and a thief. I have come for what is mine, and to see justice done." "There is no murderer here," Eli replied, his voice even, "and nothing here is yours." The sheriff shifted his weight in his saddle. "Now, listen here," he began, his voice wheezing slightly. "This is an official matter. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Amelia Jensen for the theft of $500 from her lawful husband, Jacob Jensen, now deceased." "She took nothing," Eli said, his eyes never leaving Amos, and he was not her husband. Amelia's words from the night before. He was her voice now. Her truth. Amos let out a short, humorless laugh. He was in the eyes of God in this territory, and she ran off with his savings after putting him in the ground. "I want the money, and then I want her. The law says I get both." "The law," Eli said, the words tasting like ash, "seems to have ridden up here with you." This time, Amos did not laugh. His eyes narrowed to cold slits. "I have had enough of this. Sheriff, do your duty. Go in there and get her." The sheriff looked from Amos to the unyielding man with the rifle. He looked at the dark, unblinking doorway of the cabin. He looked like a man who had made a bad bargain and was only now realizing the price. He licked his lips nervously. "You need to stand down. Mister, this is the law." "This is my home," Eli said, "and the woman inside is innocent. You are not coming in." Amos had reached the end of his patience. He gave a sharp nod to the 2 men on his right. "Go get her. Shoot him if he tries to stop you." The 2 hired men spurred their horses forward. The world exploded. Eli did not wait for them to draw. His rifle came up in a single, fluid motion. He fired, not at the men, but at the ground in front of their horses. The animals shrieked and reared, throwing one of the riders to the dirt. The other fought to control his spooked mount. In that same instant, Eli dropped the rifle, his hand already moving to the revolver holstered at his side. He was a soldier again, the years of peace falling away like a shed skin. The man on the ground scrambled for his own pistol. Eli fired. The shot was clean, and the man cried out, clutching a shattered wrist. The second rider finally brought his horse under control and fired a wild shot that splintered the porch railing next to Eli's head. Eli returned fire, and the man slumped forward in his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his chest. It all happened in less than 5 seconds. The clearing was suddenly filled with the acrid smell of gun smoke and the ringing silence that follows a sudden volley of shots. Amos Jensen stared, his face a mixture of shock and fury. He had expected a simple, brutish confrontation, not a battle with a man who moved with the deadly efficiency of a seasoned killer. He drew his own pistol, as did the sheriff, whose hands were shaking badly. "You are a dead man," Amos snarled. Eli ignored him. his attention on the remaining hired gun. He was exposed, his revolver holding only 3 more shots. He knew he would not get them all. He had bought time. That was all. He braced himself for the inevitable. A shot rang out, but it did not come from the men in front of him. It came from the dark window of the cabin. The last of Amos's men cried out and toppled from his horse, shot through the shoulder. Amelia stood in the window, holding Eli's second revolver in both hands, her face white but her aim steady. The briefest flicker of a grim smile touched Eli's lips. It was all the distraction he needed. He lunged to the side, firing at the sheriff as he moved. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of the lawman's arm, causing him to yelp in pain and drop his gun. Only Amos was left. Amos fired, his shot going wide as Eli dove for the cover of the porch steps. But Eli was not fast enough. A second shot from Amos's pistol slammed into his side, a searing, white-hot agony that stole his breath and sent him sprawling to the dirt. His vision tunneled. The world turned gray and distant. He tried to raise his revolver for one last shot, but his arm would not obey. He heard Amelia scream his name. He saw her run out of the cabin. He saw Amos's cold, triumphant face as he leveled his pistol at her. And then darkness took him. He came to in pieces. Pain was the first thing he knew, a deep, throbbing fire in his side. He was being dragged, his boots scoring furrows in the dirt. He opened his eyes. He and Amelia were being taken down the mountain. He was slung over a horse like a sack of grain, his hands bound. Amelia was forced to walk, her hands also tied, her face streaked with tears and dirt. The sheriff, his arm in a makeshift sling, and Amos led the grim procession. The wounded men had been left behind. They reached the small town below, a spectacle for the curious onlookers who emerged from the saloon and the general store. They were dragged into the saloon, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sawdust. Eli was dumped unceremoniously onto the floor. Amelia was shoved into a chair. The saloon became a makeshift courtroom. The sheriff, trying to reassert his shattered authority, declared that a trial would be held. It was a farce. Amos Jensen, acting as prosecutor, told a story of a virtuous, hard-working man murdered by his ungrateful, adulterous wife, who had then fled with his life savings and taken up with a violent hermit who resisted the law. The townspeople murmured, their faces a mixture of suspicion and morbid excitement. It was a good story. Eli tried to push himself up, to speak, but a wave of dizziness and pain sent him crashing back to the floor. His side was soaked with blood. He knew he was dying. He had failed. He had brought the war home, and he was losing. "There is no need for a long trial," Amos concluded, his voice ringing with false piety. "The evidence is clear. I demand justice for my brother. I demand that she be hanged for her crimes." A few men in the crowd shouted their agreement. The sheriff, sweating and pale, looked ready to consent to anything that would end the ordeal. It was turning into a prelude to a lynching. "That will be quite enough of that." The voice came from the doorway. It was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. An old man stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. He was dressed in a dusty but well-tailored black suit. His hair was white, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as a winter sky. "This is a public house, not a courtroom," the old man said, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the bound woman, the wounded man on the floor, and the armed posse. "And you, sir," he said, his eyes locking on the sheriff, "are a disgrace to that star you wear." The sheriff sputtered. "Who are you to come in here and—" "I am Judge Henry Wallace," the old man said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Circuit judge for this territory, and it appears I have arrived just in time to prevent a gross miscarriage of justice." A hush fell over the room. Amos Jensen's face paled. The judge hobbled into the room, his cane thumping on the floorboards. He stopped and looked down at Eli. He saw the way Eli was lying, the pallor of his skin, the nature of the wound. His eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen his share of battlefields, met Eli's. He saw something he recognized.
Someone get this man a chair and a doctor,
the judge commanded. Then he looked at Eli. Son, you look like you have seen the elephant. It was an old soldier's term. Eli managed a weak nod. Antietam, Gettysburg. The judge nodded slowly. Chickamauga, he said, tapping his own bad leg with his cane. A bond of shared history, of shared horror, was forged in that single word. A chair was brought for Eli. He was hauled into it, every movement an agony. Amelia rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. Now, Judge Wallace said, turning his piercing gaze on Amos, I will hear what has happened here, and I will hear the truth. The trial began again, but this time it was not a farce. The judge listened to Amos's story, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Amelia and, in a gentle voice, asked her to tell her side. Hesitantly at first, then with growing strength, she told the truth about her life with Jacob, about his cruelty and his debts, about her flight. Finally, the judge looked at Eli.
And you, soldier, what is your part in this?
Eli took a deep, ragged breath, the pain a hot knife in his side. He leaned forward, his voice weak but clear, and he spoke. He told them how he had found her in the river, half dead. He told them of her fear, of her quiet dignity. He told them of the rider Amos had sent and the threats he had made. Amelia Jensen is not a killer or a thief, Eli said, his voice gaining strength from his conviction. She is a survivor. She ran to save her own life and a man's home. A man's honor requires him to protect those who seek shelter there. I did what any decent man would have done. He looked directly at the judge. We have seen enough of men like Amos Jensen, you and I, men who use the law as a club to get what they want, men who value money more than a human life. That is not justice. That is just greed wearing a clean shirt. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Judge Wallace stared at Amos for a long time, his eyes like chips of ice. Mr. Jensen, the judge said, his voice dangerously soft, your brother was a known gambler, deeply in debt in 3 counties. I have signed the warrants myself. Is it not more likely that his creditors, and not this frightened woman, are the ones responsible for his death? Is it not also likely that you knew of this and saw a chance to claim his assets, if he had any left, by blaming her and having her removed? Amos stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. That is a lie, an outrageous accusation. Is it? The judge said. He turned to the crowd. Justice is not a mob in a saloon. It is the truth, brought into the light. And the truth I see here is a woman who fought to survive a miserable life, and a good soldier who stood up to protect her. I find Amelia Jensen innocent of all charges. He then pointed his cane at Amos, and I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest, for conspiracy to commit murder and intimidating a witness. Sheriff, take this man into custody. The disgraced sheriff, seeing his own future in the balance, moved reluctantly to do as he was told. The public cleansing was complete. The truth had won. But as the crowd began to disperse and a doctor finally pushed his way through to his side, Eli's remaining strength gave out. The saloon dissolved into a swirling vortex of black, and he knew no more. He returned to the world slowly, swimming up through a deep, dark water of pain and fevered dreams. For a time, he was lost in a gray fog, a landscape of disjointed memories where the roar of the Wind River mixed with the thunder of cannon fire. But through the fog, one thing remained constant, a steady anchor in the swirling chaos, a hand holding his, a cool cloth on his forehead, a soft voice whispering his name, telling him to hold on, to come back. When his eyes finally opened and focused, the first thing he saw was Amelia's face. She was sitting in a chair beside a narrow bed, her expression etched with exhaustion and worry. But her eyes, when they met his, shone with a fierce, unwavering light. He was not in his cabin. The walls were whitewashed plaster, and the light coming through the window was filtered through a clean lace curtain. He could hear the distant sounds of the town, the rumble of a wagon, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer. "You are awake," she whispered, and the relief in her voice was so profound it was almost a sob. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, and the only sound that came out was a dry rasp. She was there instantly with a cup of water, lifting his head gently so he could drink. The doctor, a fussy man with spectacles and a kind face, explained that the bullet had broken a rib and torn him up badly inside. He had lost a great deal of blood. It was a miracle. The doctor said that he had survived the journey down the mountain. But Eli knew it was not a miracle. It was Amelia. His recovery was a slow, arduous journey back to the living. He spent nearly 2 weeks in that small room behind the doctor's office, drifting in and out of a painful, feverish sleep. Through it all, Amelia was his constant shadow. She changed his bandages, spooned broth between his lips, and read to him from a worn copy of a book she had bought at the general store. She rarely left his side, and when she did, it was only to sleep for a few hours on a pallet on the floor. He learned that Judge Wallace had seen to everything. Amos Jensen was in a federal jail awaiting a trial he was certain to lose. The wounded men had been patched up and sent on their way with a stern warning from the judge to never show their faces in his territory again. The story of the shootout at the hermit's cabin had become a local legend, and its heroes were the quiet, haunted soldier and the woman he had defended. When Amelia walked through the town to buy supplies, the townspeople who had once been ready to see her hanged now nodded their heads in a gesture of grudging respect. She did not shrink from their gazes. She met them head-on, her back straight, her dignity a shield forged in the fire of their ordeal. Eli watched her, and in the long, quiet hours of his healing, he fell in love. It was not a sudden, passionate thing. It was a slow, quiet dawn. It was in the way she moved, her newfound confidence still tempered by a gentle grace. It was in the fierce, protective look in her eyes whenever the doctor examined his wound. It was in the simple, profound comfort of her presence, a warmth that had seeped into the cold, lonely corners of his soul and made them live again. He had spent 10 years building walls to keep the world out, and she had not torn them down. She had simply walked through the door he had opened and made his fortress a home. When he was finally strong enough to travel, they made the slow journey back up the mountain. Judge Wallace, who had stayed in town to see the legal matters settled, shook Eli's hand before they left. "The world needs more men who remember their honor." "Soldier," the old judge said, his eyes full of a deep, shared understanding. "You hold on to that one. She is as strong as you are." Returning to the cabin was like returning from a long and terrible war. Everything was the same, yet everything was different. The clearing was no longer a place of siege, but a place of peace. The cabin was not an exile's hut, but a shared home. That first evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold. The world was quiet, their world. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer a space of tension or unspoken grief. It was a comfortable, easy quiet. The silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. Eli broke the silence first. He turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his mind, but when he looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, they all fell away, leaving only the simple, unadorned truth. "I want to wake up beside you every morning," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he was not used to expressing. "For the rest of my life." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, the kind he had seen only once before, on the night she had found his acceptance. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She did not need a fancy speech or a diamond ring. His simple, heartfelt words were the most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined.
"Yes,"
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Eli, yes." They were married a week later, on a bright, clear morning. Judge Wallace came up the mountain to perform the ceremony. He was their only guest. They stood beneath a giant, ancient cottonwood tree on the bank of the Wind River, in the very place where he had dragged her from the churning water. The river flowed peacefully now, its spring rage a distant memory. It was a gentle, murmuring witness to their new beginning, its surface sparkling in the sunlight, the water clear and clean. Amelia wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, the color of a summer sky. Eli wore a clean shirt and a look of quiet, profound happiness that smoothed the hard lines from his face, making him look younger, freer. The judge's voice, old and steady, read the simple words that bound them together. They did not have rings. Instead, they exchanged vows in the form of a simple, solemn promise to stand by each other, to be each other's shelter, to build a life together in the quiet heart of the mountains. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Eli leaned down and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss that held all the promise of the mornings to come. The river that had once been an agent of death and separation had become the site of their rebirth. It had taken everything from them, and then it had given them back to each other, cleansed and new. Their life fell into a simple, beautiful rhythm. They worked the garden together, their hands in the same soil. They rode through the mountains, exploring the high meadows and hidden valleys. The ghosts of Eli's past grew quieter, their whispers drowned out by the sound of Amelia's laughter. The shame of Amelia's past washed away, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who was cherished and respected. The cabin between the ghosts became a cabin filled with life. One crisp autumn afternoon, they rode to the crest of a high ridge that overlooked the valley. The world spread out below them, a patchwork of gold and brown and evergreen. They were on their way to the town to buy supplies for the coming winter, their first winter together. Eli rode Ghost, and Amelia rode Patience, the gentle mare. He reached over and took her hand. Their fingers lacing together, they stopped their horses and sat for a moment, just looking out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that was their home. Amelia looked at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She thought of the desperate, terrified woman who had been swept away by the river. She thought of the broken, haunted man who had saved her. She looked at their joined hands, at the life they had built from the wreckage of their pasts. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Will you stay now?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur on the wind. Eli looked at her, his love for her a raw, powerful, and undeniable force. He squeezed her hand, his answer a vow, a promise, the final, definitive healing of all their scars. "For as long as you will have me," he said. Thank you for listening to our story, and we would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.